Well, good afternoon if you are in the east of the United States where it's 2 p.m. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays. And it is 7 p.m. in London and 8 p.m. in Florence and 9 p.m. in Cairo. And I know that people are watching all over the world. And as you know, if you are a regular visitor, that this show is about inspiration. And I tend to ask people to join me who have inspired me. In the case of Nimet Habachy, my wonderful guest, she has been inspiring me since October 20th of 1980. I know the date. And she is a genuine New York institution. Her voice, if not her face, are known to hundreds of thousands, perhaps even into the millions of people in New York and beyond for her unique program that she did for many, many years called New York at Night on radio station WQXR in New York. Nimet was there from 1980, I believe that date, October 20th, until 2007, and has returned to the station, as we will talk about in a bit. But let me start by welcoming. She's known to everyone as Nimet. Many people don't even know your last name. It was always New York at Night with Nimet. Welcome, Nimet.
Thank you, Fred. How very nice to be with you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for
So,
asking me.
as listeners immediately have recognized, this is a voice, but it is a voice that is attached to a culture, a history, a knowledge, a personality. And when you don't see the person talking to you, when you have the intimacy of radio, and it's dark outside, and you have a voice speaking to you, it is a relationship unlike many other things. The Italians have a wonderful term for it, is la voce amica. In other words, the voice as a friend. And in the absence of seeing the person, as you now see me and Nimet, when you have a voice, everything goes with it. People have different ideas of who it is and what she looks like and where she's from and so forth. And I can tell you that for decades, people religiously tuned in at midnight. And to be very specific, I'm going to talk a bit about WQXR because people around the world may or may not know it. It is America's oldest and largest classical music radio station. Every Saturday since December of 1940, it has broadcast live performances in the Metropolitan Opera in the afternoon or other theaters around the world when the Met was not broadcasting. It, to me, is not only a radio station, but a cultural institution. It has helped form and educate millions of New Yorkers in classical music and in opera. I have been honored to be connected to the station informally for decades, but formally since March of 2011. In other
Really?
words, almost 10 years. Yeah. It was end of March 2011 as their opera writer, not reviewer, but writer. And it was founded by two men, John Hogan and Elliot Sanger, in 1936, who were innovators in radio. And it was sold in 1944 to the New York Times. And most people, if they're not babies, associate WQXR as being, this is WQXR, the radio station of the New York Times, in beautiful voices that would be spoken. And there was an AM side and an FM side. And the FM side was music, and the AM side was usually talk, sometimes music as well. And there were wonderful people on the AM side, such as Robert Sherman, Lloyd Moss, occasionally Carl Haas, and George Jelinek. And I want to ask Nimet about some of these people. And the FM side was always music. Nimet knew my father, and my father was a trombonist, and my father was also an insomniac, and would listen in his home to Nimet and would call me at about 3 in the morning because I would be up listening, and he would say, "Did you hear what she just said about Verdi? I didn't know that about Verdi." or can you imagine anyone being able to pronounce Buxtehude correctly, or all of these different words? What it required of Nimet, that she did better than anyone else in music broadcasting, was knowledge of the music, but also the ability to describe it and enthuse other people about it. It was a combination masterclass in music, plus having some of the greatest performances in the world. QXR was sold to New York Public Radio, which is part of it's WNYC, part of the National Public Radio Network in 2009, and remains a wonderful cultural institution and part of the family of New York Public Radio. And we are on Idagio, which is a wonderful institution as well, based in Berlin. And I encourage listeners to stick with Idagio, but also get the WQXR app. And you'll discover the world of QXR. And you're lucky on certain nights, Nimet Habachy, who continues to do New York at night. So Nimet, that was a means of explaining the context that you and I and New Yorkers know very well, but other people might not. When did you first hear WQXR?
Probably when driving in a car, which was one of the great excitements when we first came to America. But there would be a terrific quarrel in the car as to what station to hear. And my father would want to hear QXR because, after all, it was the station of the New York Times and he wanted the news. And I must confess that I wanted something a little bit younger, or so it seemed to me at the time. But those were our first adventures in America, driving to places like Williamsburg and Massachusetts and getting to know this country that we had arrived at. And QXR, was part of our learning experience. I was grappling actually with English. I sometimes credit a children's program called Howdy Doody with teaching me English. And I'm quite serious about that because I arrived in this country speaking better Arabic than I did English. So I had some adjusting to do in terms of language. And QXR was really a beginnings of it in terms of music and in terms of language. And I remember the Sixth of Beethoven playing once, and I said, "My goodness, isn't this wonderful?" And my sister said, "Ah, well, there is hope." I think, who would have ever imagined that I'd wind up with a long, happy association with WQXR some years later?
You were born in Cairo.
I was born in Cairo, Egypt, yes.
And came to the States as a girl. And at what school year did you start in the States? You imagine elementary school or junior high school?
Actually, I entered fourth grade.
Okay.
I arrived with a rather singular background of knowing a great deal about pounds, shillings, and pence, and a fair amount about Henry VIII, his 6 wives, and Robin Hood and Maid Marian, which was not a good beginning for an American life. I went to an English school in Cairo, as did many people prior to the revolution. That is another revolution, not the 2010 one, but rather the 1952 revolution, which toppled King Farouk, if anybody remembers who he was. And things became very complicated. And my family was in a rather singular position. My father had been Minister of Commerce and Industry, and during the war, he had chosen to supply the British at El Alamein, which made him a pariah to the Nasser crowd. Mm-hmm. And it was time to leave in 1952, but we didn't leave actually till Christmas of 53. So that was our arrival in America.
And I know, because you've told me, that you had nannies in Cairo from different countries, and some of your earliest exposure to languages was through the nannies.
Well, I had an Egyptian nanny for the majority of my life in Egypt, who, because I was the youngest, she and I would be shipped off to Alexandria, and those Alexandrian halcyon summers remain with me, and with my grandmother. And so we would be speaking Arabic, and my siblings had been brought up with German. And I wound up with a wonderful Italian nanny for about a year who taught me a poem which I was to recite to my mother, but the revolution happened first. And we wound up hiding the Italian nanny in the roof of our house the night of Black Saturday, which was a night when a lot of Cairo was burned down. A date people tend to forget, but it was a very frightening day. And I do remember crowds passing in front of the house and basically asking for the toppling of the government. Mm. And we closed the lights. My mother held on to me, and we waited until they passed. They thought the house was empty. And I do remember going to my playground a few days later, and the swing where I was used to swinging was a plank of wood, and it was burned through. There was nowhere to sit. And the images of a lot of destruction and the Shepherd's Hotel, which was famous, I do remember it truly came down, as did a lot of other English bastions, including the Turf Club and a few foreign shops. And it was the beginning of something altogether other for Egypt, some of which has been a success and a great deal has not.
We're going to talk a bit later about the opera Aida, but in preparation for our conversation today, I went back last night and read a great deal of Egyptian history. I should say Egyptian history from about the year 1800 onward, not the famous old Egypt, which I already adore and was familiar with, but I didn't know much about Egyptian history in the past 250 years. And it's quite dramatic unto itself. It's very dramatic because it relates to which European powers were interested in dominating Egypt and the cultures that they brought with them. And then, frankly, the way Egypt intoxicated them. I always was fascinated by ancient Egyptian culture. And as we'll talk about in a bit, I got to go and work there in 1997 in Egypt. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. It changes you. You understand how old civilization is. And when you have such an ancient civilization that really changed the world, as subsequently did Greek culture and Roman culture, and in Asia, many nations, certainly in what we call India and China, in South America, Central America, all of these cultures still speak to us, but you and I know these cultures also through opera. And they really take on a kaleidoscopically different form in opera that if you can't really tell the story of the accurate history, you make it operatic and it becomes interesting, but then we don't quite understand what really happened. And so I know that you studied European history at Bryn Mawr along with French. I too studied it. I studied primarily Italian Renaissance history. What were your interests in European history and how did you select them?
Well, I come from a country that was, for most of its history, well, that's not true, not most of its history, but a great deal of its history, under the thumb of some mostly European power. The history of Egypt is one of conquest, if you think about it. I mean, once past your basic Ramesside dynasty, we became the property of the Hyksos, the Persians, the Byzantine Empire, the Europeans, the French, the English. It really didn't stop until 1952, when you think about it. And I think knowing that, and quite frankly, my family had a somewhat involvement, inevitably, I suppose. But I must point to the arrival of Napoleon Bonaparte, and that was the beginning of so-called Egypt's modern history. Napoleon arrived in 1798 at the Bay of Abu Qir, and Lord Nelson sunk his flotilla eventually, including L'Orient, which was Napoleon's flagship. And on L'Orient was a small fortune with which he hoped to pay the savants. the scholars that he had brought with him to Egypt to study this savage land. And now, when Napoleon's fortune was sunk, it went down with his treasure, the ship L'Orient, he was forced to borrow money. And he borrowed money from an well-known usurer of the time, who happens to have been an ancestor on my mother's side. Yeah. And his name was Girgis al-Gohari, and he's in many history books. But I figure if they ever dig up L'Orient once and for all, I think I'm owed a tidy sum. I'm not holding my breath, but there is that side of the history. And then the whole British history in Egypt is a rather sorry tale, made sorrier by an incident of 1910, when a group of English soldiers were pigeon shooting, which is something evil to do in Egypt because the peasants depend on nature, and this was killing a side of their livelihood. So they went after the British with picks and shovels, and one English soldier fell as a result of sunstroke. And the whole village was punished by one Sir Evelyn Baring, who was the viceroy at the time, and he is since known as Overbearing. But anyway, an Egyptian politician of the day was forced into signing a death warrant. And that was a cousin on my father's side, and he was the old Boutros Ghali. You know, the Secretary General, Boutros Ghali. Well, this was his grandfather and my ancestor as well. Anyway, he was then assassinated in 1910. So my family has history. I would love to know what happened before that, but I can trace us back to the 19th century anyway.
Yeah. When you came to New York and entered the fourth grade, what was it like being an Egyptian girl, one already supremely cultured and coming from this background? Did you go to New York City public schools? Did you go to a private school?
I went to a private school, and I do remember a classmate asking me if we still had pharaohs. And I had to laugh because after all, I'd grown up on Sundays. If I was good, I got to ride a donkey around the Sphinx. And that was a great treat. He was quite big, you know, if you're 6 and 7 years old, to ride around the Sphinx is quite a long distance. And in those days, I'll admit to the fact that the paws of the Sphinx hadn't even been dug up yet. Since I was a child, his paws have been dug up, and you see much more of the Sphinx than you used to. Anyway, I had a lot of adapting to do, and I think my classmates probably had some adapting to do to me as well. Mm-hmm. But I think I was a pretty quick study, and pretty soon I was pretty good on Henry Hudson, and dollars and cents began to make sense. And I was often running with a whole lot of different exposures to this fascinating new country that we apparently were going to be staying in. We always thought, well, we'd go back when things got easier, and we stayed.
Yeah. You just reminded me of something you unearthed. It's kind of like hitting a key on the computer that has not been struck in decades. My mother tells me that the very first poem or rhyming that I ever did, I was probably 3 or 4, and it was the following: I hate liver. I think it stinks. If you make me eat it, I'll go live in the Sphinx. And somehow I knew of the Sphinx way back when I was a little kid. And
Why?
Egypt had entered my imagination. So when I went to Egypt, I got to tell you, it was magnificent. And I went to Saqqara, and I went to all of these places that really were an amazing thrill. But I felt the Sphinx was sort of small. I had pictured it being an enormous thing like the pyramids. It's not. And you said to you it was rather big, I guess.
Well, I was very little when I did this little ride around on a donkey. It took a long time.
it still was an astonishment to see it.
And I
Uh,
believe when the Aida that you worked on was at Deir al-Bahari, which is one of the most beautiful of all the monuments,
yes, that
the
was extraordinary.
necropolis of Hatshepsut.
Yes, that was April 1997. We'll get to that a bit later. I want to talk about you some more. Um, you went to Bryn Mawr, and I don't think that many people, unless they grew up in the Northeast of the United States, have a sense of what is Bryn Mawr. I know it as being in suburban Philadelphia, of being a very fine school, very progressive. It tends to embrace young women who are, they know their way, they know what they want, they're very well educated and cultured and have a lot of personality. Famously, Katharine Hepburn
Oh, yes.
there. And I know that there's a pond where Katharine Hepburn used to go swim in the nude because she was in Connecticut and she liked swimming in cold water. Talk about Bryn Mawr. I've never spoken to anyone before who went there.
Well, you've landed on one of the great customs of graduating at Bryn Mawr. You can't graduate unless you go swimming in what is actually the fountain behind the cloisters at Bryn Mawr. And every graduating Bryn Mawrter has swum either for herself or for a senior for whom she is a garden party girl. It's one of the great graduating customs, essential. Of course, if you're unlucky, Haverford, the boys' school down the road, has figured out that they can have the jollies of lighting up the pond so that you are visible swimming in the nude around the cloister fountain. But if you can get past that, it's one of the traditions, along with carrying lanterns and singing songs in Greek and getting a very good education along the way.
Talk about the school, because the women I know who have gone there have all been very special. They'll have a very good sense of themselves and the world, and while it is a very fine school and known to people in the States, it's not a famous school. I have a friend, a very dear friend from high school, who turned down Harvard and Yale and went to Haverford, which was the
Ah,
young men's school down the road from Bryn Mawr,
yes.
and he never regretted going there instead of Harvard, for example. What
Well, not
what
only,
made it special?
well, I'd have to also tell you that I went to Bryn Mawr in a very particular period of time. It was civil rights and it was Vietnam. And both Bryn Mawr and Haverford are Quaker schools in origin. So a lot of my Bryn Mawr life was spent cheering on my friends at Haverford every time one of them got a conscientious objection, or one of them somehow managed to get out of going into the army and going to Vietnam, which they just, the majority, I would say, did not wish to do. So it was a key time, and there was civil rights, which was an ache in all our lives, still is. And it is or at least civil rights actually was the beginning of working against the horrors that America has apparently not yet put away. And it was a very particular time. There were freedom rides and there was great fear. And I remember one friend whom we spent a lot of time trying to convince to not drive to the South with her African American boyfriend. And it just was a time when you were taking your life in your hands if you did something as innocent and as simple as that. And I remember that. I mean, it colored my life at Bryn Mawr, all of this. And I, I remember being so upset often with things that were going on or things that were around us. This was the freedom rides and the watching of people getting hosed. And it still stays with me. That footage, you sometimes see it on TV, that all stays with me because it was part of my America life. And my sister, who went to Bryn Mawr, remembers going to a drugstore, which I won't name. It was in Bryn Mawr, the town of Bryn Mawr, and they did a sit-in. They went with their African American friend with the local newspaper and embarrassed the drugstore into changing their laws. So
Mm.
it's part of America's history too.
Now, I've never asked you this because we're close friends and I never thought to ask such a thing.
Hmm.
But given that people are listening to our conversation, when you were in a place like Bryn Mawr, were you perceived as black, brown, Asian, African, white? How were you perceived? Was there a general acceptance of you as being one thing or another?
This is one of the biggest problems I have to this day, Fred. I don't fit any of those categories. And it's always, when there is a category when there is a blank that says other, that's the one I check. And it has actually been an issue because when I got into Wqxr, I think I fit the bill on a couple of levels as far as they were concerned. Through grapevines, I learned that they were looking for women, minorities, and languages. And so I went up for the job. I was the closest thing to diverse at my high school. And then at Bryn Mawr, I was diverse. And then in my professional life, I think I have filled the slot. And in a printout I saw once of the New York Times, I'm listed as black.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting because it surprised me. It's not altogether inaccurate. I mean,
Mhm.
after all, Egypt is part of Africa, and part of Africa is, the border with the Sudan, and then the border with the north. I mean, Egypt is every imaginable race that frankly either conquered Egypt or lived in Egypt or invaded Egypt. So we are of everything. So it's not an inaccuracy, but it runs the gamut from the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, all the way to the Empire of Nubia, which is kind of wonderful.
Because you've known me for a while and you've known me in all seasons, and I say seasons intentionally, it is now January. Uh, with the
And it's cold.
pandemic, I've not been out much. I've not had much exposure to sun. I used to have a lot more hair on top of my head. There
I
was
used
a
to have a lot more
time,
hair that was black
yes, that too.
when you knew
Um,
me.
there was a time when I had thick black hair. I was considerably darker, and could be again in the summer if I had sun exposure, but things changed. But I was quite dark
Yeah.
and had this big head of hair. And I remember that you were not sure what my background was. Egyptian taxi drivers in New York City
I think you're
always
Egyptian.
think I'm
Yes.
Egyptian,
You pass,
always.
Fred. There's no question. You
I
pass.
do pass, and I've passed for many, many nationalities in the world. I have sometimes been, and you'd have to look at pictures of me from the past to accept this, been perceived as being black, which is terrific. I grew up in an interracial neighborhood in New York City and had black friends from infancy onwards, which is fabulous. We had Latino, we had Muslim, we had everything in my New York City high school and junior high school, and especially elementary school. And therefore, when you grow up as part of a collective New York City essence, it's different because it's not that you are necessarily judged for who you are, but a certain degree of cultural and assumptions come with them.
Yes.
And when I was in college, my first roommate was black, and he made the assumption that we were assigned as the only two blacks in the college. Um, and he was surprised to find out, he didn't believe me at first, that I wasn't black, and he wanted me to join the black fraternity. And I explained to him that I'm not joining any fraternity. It's not, I'm against your fraternity, but I'm not joining a fraternity. But I don't try to pass, but it's always fascinating the degree to which people behave in a subtle, different way. I don't mean racist. They just make certain cultural assumptions if they think you are of their group or not of their group. And it has given me windows into so many cultures and worlds in a way that I think that someone who was unmistakably white, whatever that is, or unmistakably black, whatever that is, would experience differently, because when someone is not sure, then they treat you as a human, frankly, which is how I believe we should all treat one another. And while New York City is not perfect, it's something that we do better than most places in the world. And it's an honor to be a New Yorker. And I know that you grew up in that New York as well.
I consider us extremely fortunate, Fred, because there is a quality of New York where a great deal of what you have just said is not the issue. The issue is, are you interesting? Are you doing something worth discussing at the next dinner party? In the good old days when we were socializing with each other, you could hardly go to a dinner party without there being somebody from somewhere else. And it is an honor to be part of that, to be exposed to that, to be daily bombarded with new thoughts or somebody's ethnicity that you don't never met before, or customs that you didn't know about, or every aspect of it. And I wish there were more such islands of life. And I consider capitals in America, university campuses, perhaps London and Paris and major capitals, but this is it's an isolated privilege. There's an awful lot that is not exposed, not educated, uh, not curious. I think what it breeds in us is a curiosity to find out more, or nowadays, ooh, I didn't know about that, I must Google it.
Hmm.
Quickly informing yourself on something that you have just heard or just been exposed to or wish to know more about.
You went to a private school. I went to a public school, which for listeners in the UK, it's the opposite of what you think. Private schools are private. Public schools are funded by the city, by the state. They are open to all children. Some children do opt, or their parents opt for them to go to private schools, which have often very fine academic traditions. Some of them have religious affiliations. Public schools obviously do not have religious affiliations. We, as part of our education in public schools, had New York City and New York State history. And it was a wonderful thing that taught us about our plurality, our diversity, without using words such as diversity. It just was there. We were told that there were Indians, native peoples who lived here when the Dutch arrived, and then Italians and Africans, not African Americans, Africans, and British and Scots and everyone, Germans, a lot of Germans started coming in the 1840s, then Irish and more Italians and Jews and people, Chinese from everywhere were coming here. And we were taught a concept that I will never forget, and it's really central to my view of New York and who we are. It was called the ladder. And our teacher told us that when I just remembered she was an Egyptian American.
Hmm,
I forgot about that. Yeah. And she
you
played the
never told me that.
piano.
Uh-huh.
Pardon me?
You never told me that.
I had forgotten that she was Egyptian. And
Go on.
she played the piano and she taught us Brahms and Poulenc when we were 7 years old, 8 years old. And she began to speak to us about the ladder. And she explained that when you get to New York, wherever you're from in the world, you're at the bottom rung of the ladder. And that as you begin to move up the ladder, in other words, professionally, academically, socially, and so on, it does mean you were going to a different class, but you were beginning to participate more in New York society and New York culture and the way we support one another. And she said, what is crucial about the ladder that all New Yorkers know
Hmm.
is at a certain point when you have your foot on a good rung, good level, you have to reach down with your hand and pull up the next person. And she said, that is the New York ladder. And she said that we must understand that New York history is based on the ladder. Now, yes, certain peoples, especially African Americans, were not pulled up the ladder in the same way. Um, I would like to think it's a wonderful philosophy that happens to some degree. I'll give a more recent example. Koreans came here and opened food markets and so on. And the peoples after them were a lot of Mexicans.
Mm.
And the Koreans pulled up the Mexicans by giving them jobs in some of the food markets that they ran. And then the Mexicans ran them and they began moving up and began opening restaurants and becoming doctors and what we all do and all the professions. And they started pulling up people from Ghana, from Guyana in South America, the next group that came. And we at a certain point had the Albanians about 20 years ago who were at the bottom of the ladder and they were being pulled up. And it's a classic New York phenomenon that's unique to us. And when I meet New Yorkers, we have a shorthand about understanding our society and our culture here that people elsewhere don't necessarily understand or experience. And I've never really had the chance until just now to speak to another New Yorker who appreciates that. And this leads me, Nimet, to the fact that when you began your radio program, New York at Night, which was the name of the program, and I was noticed it was not just evening music, it was New York at Night. At the stroke of midnight, a gong or a bell would ring because the radio station of the New York Times would chime the hour, something we don't hear anymore. And after the chime, music came on that I didn't know yet. It was by Debussy from the Petite Suite En Bateau. And this was the introductory music every night for New York at Night with Nimet. How did you pick that music of all the music you could have chosen to
Well,
be
first of all,
your?
it went on for 28 and a half years. And the way I chose it was that the higher ups at Qxr put me in a studio with a whole bunch of recordings because I suggested for a signature tune something by Debussy. And they said, no, 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 the arabesque and all of this, it's much too obvious. So they locked me up in the room and I was told to listen to music. And I did not know the Petite Suite. And I put it on and I heard the En Bateau movement. And I thought, there, that's it. And it took, they all approved. And that became my signature tune for many, many years. And to this day, sometimes when it's played, people, I gather, make the association with me, which I have no claim to it. It's just a lovely one of four pieces to the Petite Suite. So thank you, Debussy. And, you know, I chose my own music all those years and I appreciated that prerogative. I began to love choosing whatever music was going on. And I had the right to either lull you to sleep with Debussy or blow you out of your bed with the Ride of the Valkyrie. Uh, it was a
Well,
heady thing to do.
I know that you once at the New York Times, police came to the door, um, and you were concerned. Why have the police come to my studio and what's going on? What happened?
I had just started combo, which is to say I was doing the combination of running the board and also choosing the music and also hosting. So there was nobody there and I was quite frightened about that sometimes. So there was a monitor and a TV. And one day in the TV, I saw two huge policemen arrive and they had not cufflinks, they had handcuffs dangling
Handcuffs.
from their belts and revolvers. And I let them in and I said, what do you want to know? It's the New York Times building. I knew that downstairs they were stealing typewriters. This was the days of the typewriters.
Mhm.
So I was really quite frightened. And I said to the good sergeant, oh, why are you here? What's happening? He said, we're here because Sergeant Kraft, who's down at the police station, says you're not playing enough Wagner. I said, what? And he said, we're going to call the sergeant and you're going to tell him you're going to play Wagner, right? So we called the good sergeant and I said, what particularly would you like to hear? And he said, he said nothing. He was kind of taciturn. I think he was should we say, a little bit struck by the fact that I was on the phone. Anyway, but the good sergeant that had come to the door said, Brunhilde's Immolation, you know, the part with the crescendo, and he proceeded to tell me the whole of the Götterdämmerung. And I had elected to not play Wagner because I thought it was rather heavy-handed in the middle of the night. After that, I played Wagner like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
I was more than happy to keep New York's finest very happy. I thought that would be a good move. So I changed my plan, and I kept them happy, and they used to come and visit along with a handful of other people, the occasional reporters. There was a camaraderie at the old New York Times building that I thoroughly enjoyed. And I broadcast there for a good 10 years or so until we moved downtown.
I remember you also read the news.
Yes.
And at that time, there was what's called a wire, I think was the term used. And you would sometimes it would be breaking news, serious news in the world. The death of a leader, an earthquake, whatever it might have been, a plane crash. And you would transition from beautiful music or dramatic music to this dramatic news, and then would have to return to music. And did you ever change the music you put on after, even let's say you had programmed something rather intense, did you change it to something a little more mellow after?
Always.
Yeah.
I would, in 2 minutes flat, completely change the programming. And one example is I learned of the passing of Diana, Princess of Wales, at about 2 minutes before midnight. And I chased down the Fauré Requiem and the Duruflé Requiems because they're the gentlest. And I played requiems and other music, completely revamping. Once the first piece was on, I could run to the library and change the plan. But it was a very difficult thing to do. And I broke into the music to tell of the passing, or rather the assassination, of Indira Gandhi and the news from South America when the British invaded. So there were moments that I did break into music, and one of the laws was, unless it was a huge story, you did not interrupt the music. Well, a few large stories fell to my area of, or rather my period on the air, and you had to do something. And then, you kind of had to keep up with it. You had to sort of change the entire mindset of the way you were speaking. If you were feeling jolly, you toned it down accordingly. I mean, you had to do a pretty fast, almost acting effort. Wasn't acting really, but it was being always mindful of the emotions of the time, of the day, of the moment. It still is the fact. In fact, we've had plenty of reason to have to exercise that particular ability, which I hope announcers have, because one needs it. You have to be you have to be adaptable and flexible, and try to stay in keeping with the spirit of what's going on around you all the time.
It is live, as you and I are now live. I love and prefer live broadcasting. There's an energy to it that doesn't come with pre-recording. I do that too, as you have done pre-recording, but it's a very different sensation. It's just remarkable to me that two of the people you just mentioned, it's not that I'm so out there in the world, although I'm out in the world a fair amount, but I met Princess Diana 5 days before she died, and I met Indira Gandhi 3 weeks before she died.
Oh my goodness, Fred.
And Diana, because I was living in Italy then, writing a book, and I lived in a little coastal town.
Which one?
Camogli.
Oh, I know it.
And
oh, nice.
Camogli is a cove called San Fruttuoso. And I happened to go to San Fruttuoso on a beautiful day to sit on the little beach. I mean, it's a really tiny cove. and rocks. It's not a beautiful beach at all, but it's
No,
completely,
it's not, but it's a wonderful town.
it's very secluded. And Dodi Al Fayed, Egyptian, I just remembered, and Princess Diana, their yacht pulled in
Oh my goodness.
and they came ashore. And there were very few people there, and I recognized them. And they were in swimsuits. I was in a swimsuit. And it happened that she was about to see a friend, a very, very dear friend of mine in London who ran a ballet company, and she had helped commission a ballet. So I went up to her, and that was the introduction to say that you and I are, we have this person in common. And would you like to have lunch? And we sat down on the beach and we had mussels and grilled fish brought out to us from the one little fish shack on the beach. 5 days later, she died.
Oh, God.
And in the case of Indira Gandhi, I was performance manager at the Met, and it was October of 84, I'm guessing. And she attended a performance of La Boheme with her bodyguards, and she was late. And the rule at the Met, no matter who arrives, is if you're late, you can't get in.
Yes.
And because she had 9 seats, 3 in each of 3 rows, and she was to sit in the middle seat of the middle row, surrounded by her bodyguards, we couldn't cause the commotion to let them all in. She was not pleased, needless to say. And after trying to stare me down and insist that she get in, I explained to her, Madam President, you run the world's largest democracy. I didn't want to say that there was, at the moment, it was not very democratic, but at that time, it was the world's largest democracy. I said, I run my little democracy of 5,000 people called the Metropolitan Opera. And you understand that laws have meanings, and all these other people who were late for La Boheme can't get in. You can't either. Would you like some tea? And we sat down and had tea. And I discussed with her Indian art and culture, of which I adore, and especially the music, but also the theater, the poetry, the visual arts. And I said, I don't think Lincoln Center has ever had a major Indian arts festival. Would you want to do that? And she said yes. And I handed to one of her people the contact that they would reach to create an Indian arts festival. I remember the date, October 31st of 1984. She was killed by one of the bodyguards who was with her that night.
Oh my.
And
I remember.
but she had already passed along the information about the festival, and it did indeed come to pass that there was an Indian Arts Festival a couple of years later at Lincoln Center. So
I seem to remember, didn't you have words with Mr. Kissinger once?
I did, after the fact,
similar.
because he came in, he was late. He was supposed to attend with Abba Eban of Israel and Mrs. Eban. And the Ebans arrived on time. It was at Tosca with Placido Domingo in 1985, Hildegard Behrens. And Kissinger said, well, you know, when I'm late for a restaurant, they hold the table. And if I'm late for a plane, they hold the flight. And I said, we don't hold operas for anyone. I'm sorry, Dr. Kissinger. And he said, well, who have you kept out who's more important than I am? And I said, Indira Gandhi. He said, oh, okay. Would you like a drink? And that was it.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember
I also want to mention about WQXR that when 9/11 happened, September 11th, 2001, here in New York, it was the one station that did not report news.
Yeah.
I think intentionally, and it became a refuge. And I came to look after my mother in that period to see that she was okay. I was working and out, but everything changed at that time, of course. And I just put on WQXR on her radio and I left it on. And she somehow didn't want to go to the television terribly much. So for months, WQXR was for a refuge for people who just did not want or could not face the grim reality of having fires and ambulances and everything we had, because many people don't know the fires did not go out until December 16th of 2001. And we lived all that. And Nimet, it leads me right now. I didn't plan to go there right yet, but it's a
Mm.
natural segue, and then we can come back to the QXR audience. We, especially you, had a beloved friend named June LaBelle. And
Yes.
June was a presenter, the first woman announcer
At
for
QXR.
QXR. And um, and therefore she, right after 9/11, she lived very close to the World Trade Center. She
Yes.
just quit. She just left. Would you talk about June?
Well, first, allow me to tell you about one person's generosity, and that was June. And one of the reasons why we were very close and why I was very saddened by what happened after 9/11. But June, when I took my audition, they were very kind to me. They thought the voice sounded rather interesting, and that was all very well. But I did have an accent, and thank you very much, but goodbye. And June was the one who intercepted me in the corridor and said, they seem to like what they have. Try again. And I said, well, it's not very much my style, but I went off to announcers training school. I came away sounding sort of vaguely patrician and tried again. And by golly, they took me in. And but for June, I don't think that would have happened. And I will never forget that, and many kindnesses after, and a friendship that was really quite profound. And sadly, after 9/11, June lived down at the Battery. Remember the Battery Park buildings? And she was really shook by it all. And I think she had tired of being frazzled, because when she tried to come, she came back to QXR for a couple of weeks. And frankly, she was still deeply upset. And by now she had roots down in Florida, and she had thought, well, perhaps it's time. And she basically took up a life in Florida and quite honestly became the leading light of all things cultural down in Sarasota. I was sure she would, wind up doing all sorts of good things, but she did. She was doing radio, she was reviewing, she was attending everything going on, and made a very fine life, had a wonderful marriage, and then sadly became ill. And she died about 2 years ago now. I lost a very dear friend, someone who had been incredibly generous to me, I thought, always. And
June
we were
was
the
a
only
New
two women
Yorker.
who were on that rung at QXR. So we, aside from everything else there was to talk about, there was always, what are we wearing?
On the radio, what are you wearing?
No, whenever we went out to something, I mean, we were after all, we would, every
Um,
now and then we'd be seen. June was very much seen. I was something nobody quite knew what I was about. So I hope I wasn't a whopping disappointment, but I was the lesser known of the two, and I was in the middle of the night. So
June was a New Yorker, and she went to a public school, the High School for the Performing Arts.
it,
She very much embraced her New York identity, and she she became known in many ways as one of the voices of the New York Philharmonic. And one time, you and I, there was a what used to be called a radiothon, a
oh
telethon where you raise
yes.
money. And June called me up and she said, I know you know Nimet, but you don't see her very often, certainly not during the day. But Nimet is sitting in Avery Fisher Hall in the sunlight. And why don't you go and get on air with Nimet and talk about classical music and so forth? And you and I did fundraising for about 2 hours while June was taking a break before then going back to it. Um, I
Those were
mentioned this
positive
because
days. Sorry.
many in other countries, it's a little different in terms of how people in broadcasting and people in the arts uh, connect to the institutions that are part of the cultural institutions of the city. In the case of the UK, the BBC has orchestras, they do the proms and so on, and their presenters, as they're called, are rather officially presenters. But somehow in New York, we become part of these institutions' families. And I worked at the Metropolitan Opera for many years, and it was known as the Metropolitan Opera family. But at the same time, I did broadcasting, and there were people who knew me in that context.
Mhm.
You were known supremely for your broadcasting, but you also did speaking for the Metropolitan Opera. You did appearances at the intermission, the interval, talking about singers, about particular operas, composers, and so forth. There's a certain flow that we have between the official broadcasting side and the performing side. I know you worked at the New York City Opera before you came to the WQXR.
I
What
did.
did what did you do at New York City Opera?
It was my very first job, and for little to no money, I was the assistant to the company manager. I did people's paychecks. I went on tour to Washington and Los Angeles, and I did every odd job needed. I drove laryngitic tenors to doctors in LA. I picked up people at airports. I doubled as selling oranges in the last act of Carmen because I could fit into the costume. I was the Mrs. Doge in Mephistopheles walking across the back of the stage behind a horse, who luckily did not have an accident. I had a whale of a good time. I loved every minute of it on tour and otherwise. And I also wound up being language coach for French and Italian, replacing Nico Castel, who went off to the Met
Mhm.
at some point. But I was part of the New York City Opera family and learned an awful lot of opera, and frankly cherish one little tiny thing that made my life. It was sometimes rather menial stuff to do, but I had a squawk box. I had a microphone that came from the stage of the State Theatre all the way into my office. I always knew what was going on stage. And I learned a lot of music that way that I never knew. There were operas I just simply had never seen before, and one of them was The Consul, which meant a great deal to me,
I
Giancarlo
don't know.
Menotti's
Yeah.
opera. And that aria about papers, people waiting for papers to come away from tyranny, is one of the things I don't forget, because it smacks of some things that resonated with me. But anyway, the operas were at my fingertips, so to speak. I made capital on a very small job, and I've been very grateful to City Opera. I was there for 7 years, and then that was enough, and it was time to look for something else. So while looking for another job, I joined an amateur group doing Carmen, and another one doing Tosca, where I got to be a Swiss guard, all done up in gold lame at one of those tiny postage stamp stages in Manhattan that exist. And one wonderful day, I was doing my Swiss guard number, singing all the while, because you doubled as the chorus for the Te Deum.
Mhm.
Anyway, the trick was to go down the aisle, go up the stairs and onto the stage, walk in a stately fashion into the wings, and then run like hell through the parking lot and come round and do it again. Now, if you did it 3 times, you made the illusion that you were, after all, a squadron of Swiss guards. Everything was fine. And then came the matinee. I processed down the aisle, went up onto the stage, into the wing, and then tried to do my thing in the parking lot. But there was a man who was decidedly drunk, took one look at me in gold lame with the sun beating down on my gold lame breast, knelt down and sought forgiveness, thereby screwing up my major entrance in Tosca. I couldn't very well say, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm in an opera. I've got to get back in there. Anyway, so those were my forays outside.
So
Sometimes could make time for rehearsals and do amateur opera. I was
I imagine you
singing pretensions then.
yeah, I imagine you knew both Julius Rudel and Beverly Sills.
I did.
Julius Rudel being the founder, one of the key founders of New York City Opera,
Uh-huh.
Beverly Sills being its most famous singer and later manager of the company, and big personalities, the two of them.
Oh, Yeah.
Um, Tell me a bit about Beverly Sills, the singer, and then about Beverly Sills, the manager.
I can't tell you about Beverly Sills, the manager. I left before she was managing.
Okay.
But Beverly Sills, the singer, would walk into our basement offices and literally light up the joint. She was fun, she was effusive, she was loving, she wanted to know where you bought your stuff. she she wanted to talk about the puzzle that she did in 2 minutes flat that morning in ink. And she was a major, wonderful presence as the resident soprano. And on tour, well, she was magnificent. And I do remember one very particular tour when Beverly could not sing the opening night in Los Angeles. It was to have been I Puritani, and Beverly had to have surgery fast. So she, as she put it, made a couple of phone calls. And the next thing you knew, we were doing Tosca with Birgit Nielsen as Tosca and Jose Carreras as Cavaradossi. And of course,
Wow.
he could have been her grandson,
Yeah.
but never mind. It was an amazing replacement on something like 48 hours notice. I mean, these are the stories of opera houses. But then, ironically, it fell to me to hand a check backstage to Birgit Nielsen, which was just one of those strange things that will happen. And I remember
Yeah.
she comes on her first entrance is actually off stage.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the Chandler Pavilion in LA. And Birgit Nielsen stood in the wings and called Mario, Mario. And we all, as though we'd just been hit into the back of the auditorium. The voice was just so huge, so present. I remember I never experienced almost a physical blow from the sound. It was just fascinating. And she was charming. And
She
that was
was charming. There was
on
only
tour.
one other singer in my life experience who had that same hit you to the wall voice was Ava Martone.
Uh-huh.
Could
Yes,
do
I
that
can
as
see that.
well.
I'm sure
Um,
others, but this was my first experience with it, and it
yeah.
really struck me. I thought, my God, that's why we're here. The excitement of it, the vibrancy. I never got over it. Anyway, so many
And
times like that, but this was one very particular time.
and what about Julius Rudel? Listeners should know that on March 5th, I'm going to have Tony Rudel on
Ah,
as my guest. Tony being the son of Julius Rudel and very accomplished on his own. And March 6th will be the 100th anniversary of the birth of Julius Rudel. So we're going to be talking about him then. But would you, Nimet, talk about him as conductor, but also manager?
well, I think I should tell you that in certain circles we refer to Julius as God. We would inquire of each other, has God come in yet? And I took God to lunch in LA. Or that is to say, I invited him, and in very gentlemanly fashion, he took me to lunch. But I came away from sort of, oh, there's God, to do let's have lunch. And we did really become friends. It was part of family. And Julius started out as the pianist for no pay in the old days of the People's Opera.
Mhm.
And he and John White, who was the managing side of it, and he was the artistic director, led the company together for many, many years. And I thought they did it fantastically well. It was an excellent division of powers. I thought they wielded their powers with great uh, interest for the company and for people that they had known forever on bus tours, which were part of the old days of City Opera, which operated on a shoestring. I don't know to this day, really, how they did it, but they did, and they did it well. And then there were the tours, which were the invitations of, well, the Chandler Pavilion in LA and um, the center in the Kennedy Center in Washington. So 2 weeks in Washington, 4 weeks in LA, and my goodness, what times we had. And but all of these people, the choristers, Beverly, had all done the bus tours. They were close old friends. They'd, gone through one town after another, yet another bohème, another traviata. So this was a family, and I was privileged to join it for 7 years.
And you refer to it as the People's Opera. New Yorkers know that it was founded in 1943 by the Mayor
Guardia.
Fiorello LaGuardia,
Mhm.
who felt that while the Metropolitan Opera was terrific, uh, a segment of the New York population, again, we're talking about the latter, people who would want to go to the Met if they could, but could not afford it, deserved to have opera and ballet, the New York City Ballet, available to them. And for that reason, these companies were founded and they were in what used to be called City Center. It still is City Center, which was a temple. I'm not sure of what religion they observed there, but it
Mm.
was a vaguely Middle
It was,
Eastern.
it was the
Pardon me.
Shriners Auditorium
It
with the
has
word Inshallah, God willing, on the top of the proscenium.
it does have a vaguely Middle Eastern feeling to it.
Oh, it does
Um,
indeed.
and it's a remarkable piece of architecture, and that was where City Opera and City Ballet performed for a very long time until the opening of Lincoln Center. Um, this takes me back in a way to, well, I want to mention one more thing about LaGuardia. New Yorkers know that WNYC, which is New York Public Radio, which now is the parent of WQXR since 2009, um, was founded in 1924 by the mayor. And Mayor LaGuardia would use the radio station to read the comics and tell the news. And many New Yorkers' taste in music, including my own parents, was formed by the mayor's taste in music because um, they would
And
play
comics.
something. Pardon me?
And comics. Didn't he used to
Yes,
read the
comics,
comics on air?
but specifically, if they would be playing, let's say, Alban Berg or Stravinsky, um, Mayor LaGuardia would call up because the state WNYC belonged to the city, and he would say, "Take off that squawk music," is what he called it. I want my Puccini. And if you grew up in the 1920s and early 30s in New York City, you had a huge diet of Puccini on WNYC because and my parents grew up loving Puccini specifically because that's what Mayor LaGuardia wanted. And again, can't think of another city in the world where a mayor would dictate what opera the people would hear. Mayor Giuliani, for all of his abundant and conspicuous flaws, does like opera, and he too would advocate for more opera on the radio. So there is that.
Well, whoever is running the radio station very often does put a bit of a stamp on the music chosen. We did have one boss, for example, who happened to loathe Ravel. I can't think why, but that was something we all dealt with. Don't play Ravel a lot.
Would you talk about George Jelinek, who for me was a role model? And I advise readers to look him up, Jellinek. You called him Jelly.
One L.
And one L, I'm sorry. Uh, you called him Jelly, and I knew him as Mr. Jelinek. Um, and he wrote books, and that's how people can come into contact with the genius that was George Jelinek. Talk about this man.
George Jelinek was a charming Hungarian old world gentleman. And in every sense of the word, you felt it in every one of his programs, in every one of his choices of guest. He was elegance at all times. I've never ever seen anybody quite like Jelly. And he was very kind to the younger in the group. I think he enjoyed the company of June and myself. And there were many, many dinner parties with George's wife, Hedy, as well. And George and Hedy threw extraordinary dinner parties. It should be noted that George himself had one of the most extraordinary collections of opera records from way, way back. And so Hedy would make a fabulous Hungarian dinner. And while you were busily trying to digest sausage stuffed pork chops, you got to choose a very favorite piece of music. And And George always had it. I mean, I knew the voice of Bidou Sayao, but hadn't heard it very, very often. Well, George played one of the first Bidou Sayao recordings of the Bachianas Brasileiras, which she had worked on herself with Villalobos, the composer himself. And that for me was a huge treat.
Mm-hmm.
And Bidou Sayao and Licia Albanese, you probably remember, Fred, every time they saw each other at the Metropolitan Opera, which was very often on an opening night and other, fell into each other's arms and hugged each other. And it was those were the things that the opera life was made of. But George was an exponent of it in the nicest of ways, and a good mentor to June and myself.
And to me
And to you.
as well. He inscribed, I bought all of his books, and he inscribed one of them to Fred Plotkin, the man I hope to become, which is so moving because George, I think he understood the degree to which I looked up to him, not to become him. I really believe that we all have to be our own best selves, but we can learn by the example and the innovation and the courage of certain people.
Oh, yes.
He was courageous, I would like to think, in a lot of ways. I know that there was sort of a backstory there of suffering. And yet on air, he was, as you said, gracious, very elegant. He also was a proponent of sharing music. The QXR and the whole culture around it was always very egalitarian. And the AM side had all of this incredible educational programming. And much of what I learned while my dad was listening to the music on FM because he knew all this stuff, I every day would listen in the mornings to George Jelinek, Carl Haas, who would do forever essays on Beethoven's sonatas and the most esoteric things.
And play all the musical examples at
Yes,
the
that
piano
too.
in his own apartment, recording all the while and speaking as he played. I thought they were tour de force. They really were.
And Robert Sherman was another
And
who,
Robert kept you in touch with everything that was going on in the city musically.
yes. And June too, June LaBelle and Robert both were advocates for going out and doing things and recognizing institutions that may not have been as famous as the Met and the Philharmonic and City Opera, but nonetheless were doing very important work, introducing a new piece that was unknown, contemporary music. They were very connected to all of our music schools, to Mannes, to the Manhattan School of Music, to Juilliard, and all of the others, the New School. And to me, the radio station as cultural institution is something that was exemplary and something that in the rest of the world, if they don't have it, they miss it. Listening to music is wonderful, but learning music as they listened to it was something different and made New Yorkers distinct. So this brings me back to the fact that you at night continued this tradition, but under different conditions, which was to say it was dark out. And the intimacy of the listener to the presenter, the fact that I made a little list, I'm going to read it: police, taxi drivers, paralegals, bakers, all night restaurant workers, medical staff, writers at home, and insomniacs were among your core audiences, of which were many, many more.
Oh,
And
you left out gynecologists. I got a lovely letter about how pleased this gynecologist was to be involved with Brahms and babies.
how wonderful.
Sweet.
Well, I know that you had a lot of interaction with your audience. You and I met because I called up. I happened to hear the first night, and I knew the phone number of the private studio number, and I called you up, and that's how we met. Um,
Ah,
but
great.
it tell me, please, because I've never really asked you this,
Ah,
about your relationship. How did you perceive your audience? Did you program with them in mind? Because uniquely, you did your programming,
I
and
did. I was
and
the only one for a long time.
I know that.
Mostly because, frankly, I came up on a time when everybody was very busy, and they sort of thought, oh, well, she seems to know what she's about. Maybe you can program your own stuff. And I did for the first 30 years. But I quite honestly thought of it as a lovely evening that I was going to spend with friends. And what might we hear? And since it was my choice what we heard, I chose themes for us to hear.
Mhm.
Let's trace the whole of the Trojan War. I had, after all, about 7 hours every night, or 6. It depended on the weekend or the weekday. But you could do the whole of the Trojan War, starting with Offenbach's La Belle Hélène, of course, the Berlioz's Les Troyens, Andromache's Farewell, Samuel Barber, Electra, Richard Strauss, and on. So that was one. You could do food and opera, which you got involved one night. We were on the phone and I said, well, I've got a hen and I've got lots of drinking songs. And you came up with, how about Agnus Dei? And I said, no. We laughed that night as well. You forgot that, huh? I
No, I
didn't.
remember.
I thought it was very witty. I was very pleased with it, but couldn't use it.
Well, I don't know
Anyway,
if you recall also that that night it was twice a year you had to do extra service in the sense that when the clocks were set
oh
forward or
yes,
set back,
got an extra hour
you
or
got an
one
extra
less.
hour. And you programmed food for that night because you played Alexander's Feast because it was very long and there was no interrupt. You could take a little break while Alexander's Feast was on.
It also depended what I was researching and how much of a deadline I had.
Hmm.
Sometimes I had a writing deadline or a lecture deadline. And quite honestly, that's when you got a lot of Bruckner and Mahler. And if you were desperate, if I was desperate, the St. Matthew Passion, you can't
Yeah.
very well interrupt that. So I could profit from what some people would have thought was a hardship post, but I I found it wonderfully a chance to be imaginative, or a chance to explore, or a chance to make the best I knew how out of it. And by and large, it was such a privilege to be on the air and share something as beautiful as that. I played my first full ring and then couldn't come back on the air after the final moments of the Götterdämmerung. I couldn't. I was crying. And I remember getting a call from the man who was at that point head of opera news. He said, yeah, I know, I was too. And but you know, we were genuine friends by then, the audience and myself. And I remember suddenly realizing, my goodness, what is this about? I started getting the Christmas letters from families. I'd seen the children through colic. Then I saw somebody through writing a book, or somebody said thank you because they were having a rough time. And then, of course, there were the prisoners who thanked me. One said, I am now juggling pots in the prison instead of juggling the books. And then, of course, there was a man who had some rather scary plans for us when he got out. He always wanted something from Fidelio, but I was not going to play Florestan to his Fidelio, that was for sure. But I mean, you could play with the music. It was it was great fun, or at least your mind was turned with some musical in, interpretation, or some way somehow it really it all turned around the music, which the audience seemed happy with, and
I'm
we
going to share
fun
with
together.
with the listeners something you did that I imagine you recall. It's been quite a few years now. Um, I remember the date. It was July 11th of 1996. And my father, to whom I was very, very close, we really loved each other and we shared music and WQXR and many, many things, was fatally ill. And he, at a certain point, did not want to talk anymore. He just stopped talking. But music continued to be a presence for him. And he would only talk if the doctor would come in and ask him a question. But otherwise, his immersion was in music. And I decided that there were certain things that my father needed to sort of settle in his own mind so that he could pass away a little more serenely than he was feeling. And I selected some music and I got in touch with you and asked, would you play it? For some reason, it was 11 in the evening and not midnight. I'm not sure why.
Because at one point I used to go on at 11 and not midnight.
Okay.
It fluctuated over the years.
Yeah. And from 11 to 12, I sat in his hospital room and I put on the radio, and the medical staff knew not to disturb us for that hour. And the music I selected was Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks. Actually, that was second. The Beethoven Seventh Symphony first, Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks by Strauss second, and Lullabies by Monsalvace, Cinco Canciones Negros. And you played it for him and you said, Edward, this is for you. And he listened, and then you repeated the last lullaby. I didn't ask you to do that, but you played it for him again. And you wished him well. And then I switched off the radio, and I spoke to him, and he agreed to speak. And I said, do you know what I was addressing by selecting the music I did? And this is personal, so I'm not going to discuss it. But I knew that the Beethoven Symphony, Till Eulenspiegel, and the Monsalvace would unlock things in him that had to be released. And it did. And he died about 14 hours later. And I had the radio on, and just coincidentally, when he died at 2:42 in the afternoon on July 13th, they were playing Cecilia Bartley singing Parto, Parto, I leave, I'm making my departure, from La Clemenza di Tito by Mozart. And so you were hugely instrumental in helping my father die more serenely, to which I'm eternally grateful. And
I think you thank Monsalvace and Beethoven.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm glad I could do that.
Yeah. Well, it was very special. I mean, it proved to me again something I've always understood, and something I know you know, and that millions of people would recognize if presented to them. The way music informs us, the way we live with it parenthetically. My dad being a musician, and I growing up in a home of a musician who practiced by my cradle, I was, believe it or not, a delayed speaker, because he didn't talk to me that much as a child. My mother did when she came home from work, but during the day I was with Dad, and he'd practice his trombone for hours and didn't converse. So my first language was music. And my reasoning and understanding of sounds and pitches and so on came from his practicing the trombone, and not from developing a vocabulary, which I made up for it, but I was rather delayed in my acquisition of spoken language. And so it did not surprise me that at his end, he put spoken language aside and just wanted music. And, you know, we live with this, and you and I and people who do what we do share it, not because it's the fancy thing to do or because it's appreciation. It's much more than appreciation. It's life experience, it's love, it's understanding. And you, for many, 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 many people, were and are consequential in making music available to them in a context. And so that's why I asked you about how you programmed, because yes, many nights it was thematic, but also I recognized sometimes in listening that it might have been that the weather outside was a factor that maybe made you put something on or not. I also realized that you probably closer to dawn played music to get people going, and you probably had many people join in about 4 a.m. who were starting their days, whereas I came in at midnight unless I was still working at the opera.
I was distinctly aware that people either were with me from the very, very beginning and possibly had never heard me past 1 or 2 in the morning, or they only joined in at about 5 in the morning, and caught the last hour and the bridge into the new day. But those were the fun things about the radio program. You could plan it according to who you thought was out there. And I also knew perfectly well that around about 4 o'clock in the morning, it was pretty sparse out there. And
Yeah.
those of us who were there kind of enjoyed the music together. And I, I was pleased that I sometimes got it right. For some people, it was the right piece at the right time of night.
Well, let's not pretend about something. Yes, there were all those people up working and so on. You were also addressing a lot of people who were in bed.
Yes.
And some of them were, I know many people who kept it on and in their sleep, they would have it on and they would hear this different music, which meant if you suddenly played Electra at 3 in the morning, that could disturb their sleep. I'm going to say it. I remember one night you were wondering whether the listener had arrived later in the program, and you said, "Did you just come?" But then you quickly said, "And I welcome you if you have."
Well, at least I caught it. Oh dear.
Was there, if you could name a couple of listeners, not by name, but in terms of their response, who particularly affected you in terms of their response to the work that you did and do?
Well, I once did a program about all the French composers, mostly French, who could have been the stand-ins for Vinteuil, who's the invented composer in Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Times Past. And I got a wonderfully erudite letter from a listener who basically wrote a seminar. It could have been a lecture within a series on À la recherche. And I really appreciated it. And I think I cited it at the time, but César Franck, Saint-Saëns, Debussy, Reynaldo Hahn, all of them were stand-ins for Vinteuil, and Proust never revealed which one particularly was indeed the sample for Vinteuil. But that was a fun kind of letter to receive. It made me feel that we were having a dialogue about something that I found very interesting and maybe a tad obscure. The music was fine. I just played music of Franck and Saint-Saëns and Debussy in the course of the night with a lot of other things in between. When you have 6 hours to play with, you can get pretty imaginative and do all kinds of things, or spend the night doing the most romantic arias of them all. And that was rather suggestive and evocative. And then, of course, there's Let's Hear Rusalka, sung by everybody, the aria, the song to the moon from Dvorak's Rusalka. Frederica von Staudi's version, everybody has sung it at some point. Renee Fleming. And you come away with something that you've been thinking about through the night if you're there all night. You've heard by then 7 versions of the one aria. Whom do you prefer? What did you find particularly exalting, and what touched your soul the most deeply? Whose interpretation? So one had a dialogue without necessarily ever meeting these people. But periodically, I would get into a cab and somebody had been listening, but cabbies were a rare breed because many of them did listen in the night. They really did. And I, however, got into one cab once, and I had done a Christmas program and it was playing on the air, and I was with somebody and I was quite excited. So there I was during the daytime. It didn't happen to me very often. So I said to somebody, to the cabbie, that's my voice. That's me on the radio. And the cabbie turned to me and said, "Oh, is it live?" I think because I worked at night, I had the most extraordinary variety of reactions, and buying lettuce at 5 in the morning on the way home. I rode a bicycle to work, as you know, very often, and I would stop in and buy bib lettuce for the evening's dinner party, which I would be cooking in a few hours. And well, the proprietor of the shop decided I was a lady of easy virtue on a bike. And that took me by surprise. But yeah, what's a broad doing abroad at 5 in the morning or 5:30? So I had my fair share of adventures. Let's put it that way.
New York City taxi drivers, many of them, and they're from all over the world, listen to WQXR a lot. And when I'm in a taxi where the driver is playing the station, I thank them for playing it. And more than a few of them have said to me, when I play the station, I get better tips. That's why.
Really?
And I said, but you like the music? They would say, well, I've gotten to like the music and the presenters and so on. But I put it on because my buddy told me that I'll get a bigger tip if I have classical music on.
Well, I've given a bigger tip when they know who the hell I am.
Yeah, you have to then, because otherwise, oh, she sounds good on the air, but she's
But
an
she's
idiot.
stingy.
Um,
I
uh,
remember the first time I opened an account at a nearby shop for I think it was actually the liquor store. And
mm,
I didn't say anything. And I said I'd like to buy such and such, but then I opted for something less costly. And without, I never said my name. He said, "Oh, doesn't WQXR pay you enough?" I thought, anyway, but it's funny because a voice is a strange thing. People will sometimes recognize you immediately.
especially yours.
Well, that
Another,
I can't hear it, but
believe me,
it's been said.
another benefit of your programming for all of us who listened and listen is that you would often read the texts of songs of poetry in the original language and beautifully, be it French, German, Italian. And that added so much more because let's say you were playing a Berlioz La Mort de Cléopâtre, for example, The Death of Cleopatra, which I love, you would read the text and in French. And it made hearing the music more interesting because you would hear how Berlioz set the words. And this is what I mean about WQXR often, and you certainly, educating without forcing it. It didn't feel painful.
It was a
But
purely selfish choice. I knew that I enjoyed it, and I took the liberty of thinking someone else might like to hear what the Baudelaire poetry sounds like in French and then translate it in English, and then hear the Duparc song sung by Jesse Norman, for example, or
yeah,
something. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that I only did it because I know how it has enhanced things for me, and I took the liberty of deciding the audience might like that as well. So yes, I did do that, and I think I was the only person at QXR who stashed a Bible in my cubby because so often there would be a Bible reference. I spent my life looking for Salome. I always lost her just before I was going to play something. A piece from Strauss's Salome. I always had to find it again. I think finally it's in Kings or maybe it's Judges. Anyway, but I always lost Salome and had to look her up all over again. But but I kept Bibles and I kept French poetry, and sometimes you just did it from the libretto or from some source, and because that just I thought would enhance. Anyway, that was the joy of. I think you could not really do that so easily during the day because
yeah.
you were hidebound by commercials and all kinds of things. I was much less so. I just had to find the last piece that fit into the grid, and
Mhm.
that would be it. So I had all kinds of freedoms, which I thoroughly took advantage of, as you can hear.
Speaking of judges, let's go to Aida, where there's a judgment scene. Um,
That's
I'm
true.
sure that you're
I was wondering how you get, boy, talk about a link. Wasn't ready for that one. Good, Fred.
um,
You can still do Unused Day.
you have no idea. If I can write my first poem about the Sphinx, you know where I'm coming from. But number one, I decided last night to sit down and make a list of operas set in Egypt. And here's my list, and I know there are many more. Verdi's Aida, Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, Rossini's Mosè in Egitto, Handel wrote an oratorio, Israel in Egypt, Massenet Thais, Philip Glass Akhenaten, Handel's little known opera, but my mother has the name Berenice, Regina d'Egitto. Uh, an opera I really love that doesn't get done very often is Massenet's Cleopatra. Um, Barber's Antony and Cleopatra, Handel's Julius Caesar, Mozart's Thamos König in Ägypten, kind of sort of Richard Strauss's Die Ägyptische Helena, not
Yes.
really, but I sort of, there's an Egyptian character. Bizet's Jamila,
Mm-hmm. My mother's
Severio,
first name.
oh really?
Yes,
Okay.
Jamila. Ah,
Severio Mercadante, who was very famous in his time in Naples and especially Milan, Nitocri, named for a Queen Nitocris of Egypt, and then not an opera, but Berlioz's Death of Cleopatra. I'm sure there are many more. Did I leave any out that you think of right away?
I can't think of any, I have to admit.
Okay. Um, but the most famous is Aida, of course. And I must say, although I'm a Verdian to my teeth and adore him, he's my hero, it was not the first Verdi opera that I loved. It took me a long time to really engage with the opera Aida, not because I disliked it.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't speak to me in the same way that some of the others did. I'm speaking in the past because now it really speaks to me a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
it took a long time. When I had to work on that production in Egypt in 1997, obviously I had to go back and relearn it and really learn it. But what struck me so much when I got to Egypt and I would ask people about the opera Aida, um, now the Egyptians are not necessarily the good guys in this opera.
I was just about to say there is nothing Egyptian about Aida when
I
you
know
think
that.
about it. An
I know that.
Italian composer, a Greek a Greek impresario, let's see, a French librettist
Hmm.
is nothing. And furthermore, the Egyptian is a traitor. So there,
Yes. And Aida, the title character, is in
it's
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia.
But when I would ask the many Egyptians when they would say to me, "Why are you here? I'm working on a production of Aida." Um, they would say, "We love Aida. It's about the," and the same sentence, the same phrase always, as if we were taught in school, about the glory and superiority of the Egyptian army.
Gloria all'Egitto, the chorus.
Yeah. That's what I was told, the glory and superiority of the Egyptian army.
Oh,
And
I hadn't even thought about the army, but anyway.
which is never how I thought of it. I think of it now in a very Verdian way as public responsibility versus private desire and beliefs. And that plays out in Don Carlo and Simone Boccanegra and many, many operas of Verdi, La Traviata in a completely other way. Um, and therefore, when I hooked into that, and then, of course, the magnificent music and all kinds of other things, um, doors started opening for me. But when you grew up and when you first learned the opera Aida, how did you connect to it as an Egyptian, but also as a music lover and then someone who worked in opera?
Well, my very first connection was something very particular to almost every Egyptian of my generation. The March from Aida may very well be the first piece of music that ever penetrated my conscience because it was the BBC signal tune for the news from the BBC in Cairo, which everybody listened to religiously. I was convinced that Winston Churchill lived in that little box. And he came on after the March from Aida. So that was under the stairs in the radio, which was a nightly occurrence. And I think I knew that before anything else, except perhaps Rondo alla Turca, which is the first piece I ever fell in love with. Mozart's Piano Sonata, Köchel 331, I think it is. Anyway, these were the first things that penetrated my head. But then Aida featured because I had a little cousin who was in ballet school. And every time there was a production of Aida that came in from Italy and played in Cairo, the local kiddie ballet would be employed to do the ballet sequences in the second act. So Aida, was music that I heard very early, but I was smitten with it all at age 7, my very first trip to America, when my mother took me to what I imagine was city center. And there was a very pretty lady with a red dress and a tambourine, and we walked out before the end. I believe it was Carmen. Anyway, I thought, this is wonderful. And it came on the heels of my mother playing the piano for me in Cairo from the Golden American Songbook. And my nose reached the piano keyboard. My mother was a pianist who studied in Germany. She went as a 17-year-old and wound up staying for 2 years and came back steeped in all manner of music. Anyway, so I grew up with my mother playing piano and I sang. And that was what we did when the bigger kids, my siblings, went off to school. So that was my upbringing. And then we had records. And I grew up hearing the Adhan, the call to prayer in the minaret, around me 5 times a day. My mother practicing Schubert and Chopin. My brother was playing Malagueña at this point. And when the parents went to America and came back, they came back with American musicals, including Annie Get Your Gun, which I could parrot. Never understood what the hell I was talking about. The one about, I'm quick on the trigger with targets not much bigger than a pinpoint on number 1. You had to do it like Ethel Merman or it didn't count. Now, I didn't know what the hell, but I glommed onto all of it. And Aida grew for me when I inherited all my brother's records. He went off to Harvard and bought $2 worth of highlights from about 50 operas. And I got all of those operas and took them to Bryn Mawr. So, I mean, I grew up with it. And at age 12, I was standing room at the Met. As long as I got my homework done, I was there. And I guess I just, Aida, I knew by osmosis. I knew it cold by the time I was beginning to go to the opera, along with Tosca and Traviata, and thank God for Anna Moffo. I totally fell in love with it all then. And I subsequently met Anna Moffo and confessed to her that I had asked for her autograph many years before. And Anna turned to me and said, "Oh, was I nice?"
I want to mention
yes,
to
Anna, you were
listeners,
very nice. Thank you.
to listeners that every one of my guests provides a list of music that inspire them, and Nimet's includes La Traviata with Anna Moffo, Cantaloupe's Songs of the Auvergne with Frederica von Stade, who I had here January 1st, Victoria de Los Angeles, singing Spanish songs. Flicka von Stade spoke about de Los Angeles. Siegfried's Funeral March, I'm going to get back to that in a moment. Saint-Saëns Piano Concerto number 5 in F. Why that?
Because it's known as the Egyptian Piano Concerto.
Okay, that explains it.
The middle movement is pure taqasim, which is Arabic music improvisation. And he tries for it with the Western idiom. And it's not quite taqasim, but it is evocative. And I like it very much. And he loved Egypt and he died in Algeria.
Yes, I know.
He loved the Middle East and he spent like a good European. He escaped the cruel European winters towards the end of his life by spending them in the Middle East. So the Egyptian Piano Concerto was inspired by a Berber song that he heard somewhere along the way.
I see.
And it's a very handsome concerto. Anyway.
And then there's the prologue to Boito's Mephistopheles. I imagine that's a City Opera connection, or no?
It's a City Opera connection because I learned the opera when Norman Treigle was singing it at City, and I heard it on the Squawk Box. And I loved that opener, that prologue. Nothing is like it. And I opened my own night show with that piece. It was the first piece ever played on the night program in October of 1980. Yes.
Um, Back to Aida. It opened in Cairo. Listeners know the story, I believe. We'll make it very short, that it was intended to open the Opera House in Cairo in 1869. It opened instead with Rigoletto, and the Opera House performed it December 24th, 1871, with an Italian cast. And Verdi did not go to Egypt,
He
but
was
it
afraid he'd be mummified, he said.
but it came very soon thereafter to Milan, February 8th of 1872, with another mostly Italian cast, but none of the same principles. And I always wondered why that was, that nobody who sang
Mm.
in the Egyptian Italian cast managed to get to Milan for the Milan premiere. Do you have any idea?
I have absolutely no idea, except that the one who premiered it, I believe, in Milan was La Strozzi, who was one of his favorite sopranos.
Therese Stoltz.
I'm sorry, La Stolz. Did I say
Strozzi or,
Strozzi?
Strozzi or
I'm sorry,
Florentine?
Palazzo Strozzi. No. I meant La Stolz.
Yeah,
Anyway, he may or may not have been having something of a liaison at the time,
right.
but she was the one who premiered it, and I really don't know the answer to that. Perhaps, quite frankly, they didn't wish to go to Egypt for one reason or another. It was a very stellar event with the Empress Eugenie in tow, and the only reason the Empress ever went was that France's reputation with, well, they needed refurbishing a little bit, and her cousin was Ferdinand de Lesseps, who built the canal, which people don't realize.
Really?
Mm.
I know that Verdi donated a portion of his fee to French victims of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, because Verdi was a mensch, as we say in Italian. And Teresa Stoltz became an important figure in his life. Whether or not they had a romance, we don't know. He was married to Giuseppina Strepponi, but after Strepponi died, Stoltz was a companion to the very old Verdi, and Verdi left funds to build La Casa di Riposo per i Musicisti, the rest home in Milan that still is there, where I've gone and worked a lot, and it's a fantastic place in Milan. And Verdi died January 27th of 1901, but he did not want that it be opened in his lifetime because he didn't want to have to accept the thanks from people who he was helping. So it opened October 10th of 1902. His birthday was October 10th. And it was Teresa Stoltz who oversaw the
Oh,
opening, the development of the home, and she made that her mission.
I
And
never knew that, Fred. That's wonderful. Uh-huh.
he and Strepponi were both buried there, and there's sort of a crypt. And the words above his tomb are by D'Annunzio, Gabriele D'Annunzio, pianso e amò per tutti.
Mm.
He wept and he loved for everyone. And that was Stoltz's idea to put that there. So she's a very important figure. But going back to the Milan, I gather, and you please correct me if I'm mistaken, that Verdi slightly adjusted some of the role of Amneris for Milan, where maybe because she was the Egyptian princess, Italy at that time was a new nation. Rome had just become the capital, but before that, uh, Turin and then Florence were the capitals. And already Verdi, who had fought to make this united nation of Italy, the Republic of Italy, um, saw things becoming fractious. There had been the Franco-Prussian War. Um, it was a time of war and disturbance there. And Verdi, at the end of the opera, the last words are by Amneris, who says, pace, pace, peace. He added four more paces in there so that the audience would hear 8 times, I believe, Amneris repeating pace, 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 because Verdi understood war. He understood Aida's an opera in part about war and what war can do. And Verdi added that, and to me that's what hooked me into the opera finally.
Mm.
When I know many mezzo-sopranos who say that the great role is Amneris, and Leontine Price would say, no, the great role is Aida. I'm not getting into that discussion, but it is Amneris who has the last words, and the understanding or the exhaustion that she experiences imploring, because she says, Pace imploro, I'm imploring that we have peace, was very, that was my way into the opera finally, to feeling it deeply.
Well, let's not forget that Verdi was very much the patriot. He served very briefly in Parliament in Italy. And he was, I think he took on the opera because of his sense of justice. I mean, he himself was a very, very noble kind of figure. I think probably an impossible human being to live with. But there was a nobility to him. He had suffered dreadfully in his early life, losing wife and children. And the career almost didn't happen because the grief was so great. So he had a very strong sense of correctness, I think, about everything. And it made him probably a great national zealot almost. And he, of course, wrote his Requiem for Manzoni. And he, I think, always found whatever was the nobility and whatever was the work. Again, I would cite Traviata. I mean, who's more noble than Violetta, who gives up the man she loves? I mean, that second act is a killer, really, especially when sung by Moffo. I think she does a fabulous job with it. And I think Verdi was close to the end of his life. Actually, he came back to write Aida at age 80. Let's not forget. I mean, the whole story is really pretty magnificent. Mm-hmm. And indeed, they just come through the war. And the reason that Aida did not open in Egypt was that the costumes and the scenery, which had been built in Europe under the supervision of the crew in Italy, could not get it to Egypt. So therefore, that's why they opened with Rigoletto, and that's why Aida doesn't play in Egypt until very much later. But anyway, all of this is to say that I think Verdi was an extremely noble individual in his way. And I think seeing Italy in such straits must have been very, very painful for him and for his wife, for everybody. So
to conclude, because you and I could talk for, you did 6 hours a night. I think we could do 6 hours today. But as they say in some opera, il faut partir, hélas, we must go. I was in high school, I was in a program for gifted children, and it was known as the Cherub Program. We were all cherubs. And while I was a cherub, you were an angel. And you were an angel in Florence in the 1960s, because Florence and Venice both suffered terrible flooding in November of 1966. And in Florence, the Arno River rose and destroyed artwork. And you go to Florence now and you see these watermarks that were very high, and you realize how much destruction happened. How is it that you went to or got to or were in Florence and became part of the population of many young people, especially Americans, who helped clean up the city and restore the artworks? You were called an Angelo di Fango, a mud angel.
My only title in life, of which I'm very proud. I am an angel of the mud, because that summer I'd had 2 years of Italian at Bryn Mawr College and didn't want to lose it, and signed on with the Committee for the Restoration of Italian Art, CREA, created by Jackie Kennedy. And I went to Italy on my own steam, and I lived on the 5th floor of one of the flooded buildings hard by the Duomo. And I still remember I had to literally hold my nose until I negotiated the first 4 flights. Then I could breathe. The smell was still so strong of mold and mud. And then every day I sat in Michelangelo's designed National Library and worked my tail off with every nationality, for whom I became the translator of the table, because we had Iranians, French, and somebody else, and a smattering of just every corner of the world, working for nothing to rescue not the books. I was too junior to work on the books. I was working on the index cards to find the books in the library. And these had gone face down into the mud. And I spent my days sanding off the card so you could find the book. And I headed first folio Shakespeare. I remember that. And then they hung up every page to dry. It was all very archaic, but they finally finished the work after about 20 years. But we were there in the forefront of it. And I stayed long enough to see the Calcio, which is the medieval football game on the Piazza della Signoria in the middle of town, with a parade, a medieval parade at the beginning of it, with Count Emilio Pucci in white doublet and hose on a black horse, with his two sons in black doublet and hose on white horses. I mean, it was something to behold. And then they proceeded to try to kill each other in a football game. It was incredible. But the biggest thing that the Florentines were celebrating that year was not the culture which they had managed to mount despite the flood, which was the big event. But the celebration was that the Donatello Magdalene had been restored. And I still cry when I think of it. For them, that was to celebrate. And that's Florentines for you.
Absolutely. Nimet, just one more thing. How can people elsewhere in the world hear you now? Because you still do evenings each week, pre-recorded of New York at Night, so that they can experience some of what we New Yorkers have known for years.
Well, it's 3 shows a week, Fred, officially, and sometimes it's a little more than that. But I'm on the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So Friday night to Saturday morning, and Saturday to Sunday. And I still there, happy to be.
And it's wqxr.org. Yes. So listeners, listen to Adagio all week. Please do. We want you here too. But if you want just a little bit of experiencing New York at Night with Nimet, you can go to wqxr.org, or there is an app as well. Nimet, this was really wonderful.
Fred, thank you so much. It was very sweet of you to ask me. I'm very pleased to have been here.
It has been a pleasure. And when this pandemic ends, I'll see you in life. But in the meantime, I'll be listening for you.
Inshallah, God willing. I look forward to it very much. Thank you, Fred.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, dear.